Hello there. Or for those of you that came to our Winter Tree ID workshop as part of our Tom Talks, we ran out of time a little bit at the end. So here is the extended version of the species that we did at the end of the presentation that we kind of had to skip through before. All right, Tom, you should be able to share your screen.
So here we have the roses. Now there are a number of different roses that grow in our area. The most common one, the most troublesome one, is the multiflora rose, which is a rose from Asia that was brought in as a living fence in the middle of the 20th century and just gotten loose, and now it's growing everywhere. You can see the characteristic of roses is that at least many species have prickles. And the prickles on multiflora rose are particularly large and sharp and hooked. And you notice how the point of attachment is elongate. So if you actually put your thumb on that, it's easy to pop them off if you push from the side. But if you're trying to walk through a multiflora rose thicket, it's a very strong attachment longitudinally. So the prickle will not break off. Rather, it goes right through your trousers into your flesh, which makes them very uncomfortable to work around. These can be a very large shrub. Can grow maybe 12, 15 feet in diameter in a cattle pasture over decades. Just huge multiflora rose bushes. We more commonly encounter it as a smaller plant, but very troublesome when you're walking through the woods. But there are a number of native roses. So all roses here aren't bad. You can be careful when you go out doing your clearing of exotics in the woods and prairies of the Chicago area. You don't want to get rid of the native roses, like pasture rose, which is Rosa carolina. This one has long, narrow thorns, or excuse me, prickles. And you can see that they are not at all like the prickles of multiflora rose. This stays as a relatively small shrub, doesn't grow into giant sizes, and doesn't get up around head height, at least not in my experience. The sunshine rose, Rosa arkansana, is somewhere between bristly and prickly. The bristles are large enough where they do cause some pain when you run into them. So you might say it's just very fine prickly pattern all the way out to the tips of the twig. Whereas you see that same sort of bristly, prickly nature to the early wild rose, but really more toward the base. And as you get in the upper parts of the plant, and this one can easily grow 3-4 feet tall, it is smooth, has relatively few prickles up toward the top. So there are the roses. 3 out of the 4 of them are native. So be careful when you're clearing areas, even though most roses you'll run into are the multiflora rose. There are a number of native ones out there that you need to be aware of when you're clearing your woods. Sumacs, probably anyone who's walked trails in McHenry County knows these two sumacs. They're fairly abundant in almost all of our woodlands, maybe not in really shady woodlands, but woodlands that have openings and edges. You'll find sumacs, very thick twigs. They grow in these big clones. So in each of those 2 photographs, you're probably looking at one individual and many stems coming off of a common root system. This is typical of a dioecious plant. So we have male plants, individuals that have only male flowers, and the male flowers are ephemeral. They just disperse pollen and fall off. And we have the female plants that will then develop seeds once fertilized and fruits. And so when you see a clone of sumac that looks like this, it's the female clone. Here is the male clone. You'll see both of them growing right next to one another. Twigs, very easy to recognize, big, broad twigs. It's a large compound leaf, so again, a big, broad leaf scar. Here, the leaf scar goes all the way around the bud. The bud is a small, fuzzy bud, and the leaf scar goes all the way around the bud. Big, smooth twig with a large brown, sort of yellowy brown pith. The sumacs in McHenry County, at least 99% of them are smooth sumac. I'm not convinced that I've seen a native staghorn sumac in McHenry County, but I have occasionally seen a staghorn near dwellings. I suspect they're getting loose from ornamental sumacs people are planting around their homes that are usually a variety of or horticultural selection of the staghorn. Willows are a confusing group, but recognizing the group isn't difficult, and we can at least look at a couple of common species within the group of willows. If you look at willows closely and look at the buds, at first you don't see any bud scales because there's only one scale and it covers the entire bud like a sock. So there are no seams, there's no valvate scales like praying hands, or no imbricate scales like shingles. Rather, it's just one scale, and this scale will either just loosen at the base and push off like a sock, or it will split open, as you see in the left on the pussy willow, which is a fairly large, for most willows, fairly large buds, and as it pops open, you get that white furry flowering shoot that first starts to come out. I mean, these cuttings are used widely and for people to bring them indoors and put them in vases. In the springtime, these are popping in March, so they're already well open. In fact, maybe near finishing flowering now, whereas something like the sandbar willow, not nearly as pretty, I suppose, much finer twigs, much smaller buds. And you'll see the characteristic two-tone color of the sandbar willow, in that sense, much like what we looked at in the gray dogwood earlier in the presentation, with gray bark on the twigs down below and the more tawny to reddish brown color for the twigs in their first year of growth. Again, you see the bud, even though it's smaller, has the one sock-like bud scale on it, and these won't pop off and start to flower for even a few more weeks from today. So they're much later than the pussy willow. This one grows in massive clones like this. It's much more of a problem in restoration because when it gets into a grassland, it's really hard to kill all of those stems. Whereas the pussy willow more often grows in these clumps. So a clump growth form and then a clonal growth form with the sandbar willow. Grapes, I think, probably need little explanation because most of you already recognize the grapevine and those tendrils that reach off and wrap around things. All vines need some way to hold on to a host plant and climb up, and the grape uses these wrapping tendrils. Here you see the mature grapevine in the west. In the left-hand part of the screen with that shreddy reddish-brown bark, there's the wrapping tendrils, and here's a grapevine that's just completely swarmed all over a shrub or dead tree and is bearing fruit in the fall. Aspens and cottonwoods, the poplars as a group, the genus Populus, are both common in our area. Aspen is quite common in McHenry County. It really falls out as you go south. By the time you get to DuPage County, it's extremely rare. In the southern part of the Cook County or southern part of the Chicago area, it really disappears altogether. And as you go north from the Chicago area, trembling aspen is common all the way from here to the Arctic Circle. Notice the bark at the base and the contrast. Here we have a great example of trembling aspen. And you can see from this perspective the relatively dark, ridged and furrowed bark at the base and becoming very light colored and smooth above. Here's the bark up close at the base. You can see the former epidermis here turning darker, splitting, creating those raised ridges, sort of interlacing raised ridges. And then as we look up the tree, you can see it become lighter, smoother, and a sort of white to light green color up above. Here's a great example of a young cottonwood tree, probably about 6 inches in diameter at the base. Notice how the bark at the very bottom of the tree is textured, sort of moderately ridged and furrowed. And as we look up the tree, you start to get that light, smooth bark that all poplars have as you go up the tree. Let's get a little bit closer. Now you can appreciate a little bit better the texture of the bark at the bottom of the tree. I've got some other pictures that show the really, really deeply furrowed bark of the mature tree. But that's a typical pattern on an eastern cottonwood. So here you see the aspen bark rough at the base and light up above. And aspen twigs, the buds, well, it looks like they've been lacquered and polished. That's not a trick photograph. They actually look that way. They're not wet or sticky. They might even look that way in this photograph. They're just like a hard, very, very shiny, lacquered appearance. Now, if you compare that to the buds of an eastern cottonwood, similar shape, the cottonwood is generally a sort of coarser twig and a bigger bud. But the bud as a, well, if this was a rock, you'd call that a vitreous surface sheen. Smooth, but not brightly shiny. If you squeeze the bud, it feels sort of resinous and will start to get sticky between your fingers. Here is that super deeply furrowed bark at the base of a really large cottonwood and becoming light colored above. For my money, not quite as light colored as a trembling aspen, but still light and smooth above, rough and furrowed at the base. In fact, everything in the genus Populus follows that same pattern. Hazelnuts, a really pretty shrub, a native shrub, probably the most common native shrub in our area before European settlement. You can see a number of interesting features. Here is the bristly twig. If you look at a hazel twig early in the growing season, by the fall, sometimes these bristles have fallen off. Sometimes these bristles are stiff enough, they'll kind of stick in your fingers. Other times they just flake off when you handle the twig. Here is the female flower of a hazel, tiny little flower, really pretty. It's actually a little brighter red than this photograph indicates. Pretty little flower. That's all that is the stigmas of the flower gathering the pollen, and the pollen is coming from these long hot dog-like catkins that disperse the pollen on the wind. So this is a wind pollinated plant with catkins. It will hold those hot dogs all winter long, and then in the springtime they lengthen out and disperse the pollen. So that's hazel, typical growth form of hazel growing in a big bunch like this. It does spread by the roots, and that bunch will get bigger and bigger over time. Autumn olive is one of the troublesome exotics of our region, not to the degree to which something like honeysuckle or buckthorn would be, but in the case of autumn olives, one of the easier plants to identify in winter, because all parts of the plant, the leaves in summer and the twigs in winter, are covered with these golden scales. Golden, or in the case of the leaf, silvery scales. The scales are actually little hairs with a flat top to them and a very shiny upper surface. So in the sunlight, it just jumps out at you as you walk down the trail. You taste the fruits of this. They're little fruits with a stone inside, but the soft part of the fruit has a very tangy flavor. It is prickly, but the prickles are often not really abundant, so that's not always a really good identification character. The sheen of the twigs, these gold and silver scales, are unmistakable, impossible to confuse that with anything else in our flora.
Do you need a hand lens to see it?
Well, the scales, the individual scales, you would need a hand lens to see. What you see without a hand lens is it's a shimmering result of all those scales together reflecting the light. And our last species today is another troublesome invasive. This is Oriental bittersweet. And unlike grapevine that has tendrils that grab onto things, or poison ivy that has little rootlets that grab onto things, here the entire vine just winds around the host plant. You can see both examples, the two upper photographs, upper left and upper right. They will start to wind even around other stems of itself, creating this coiling, almost ropey look to bittersweet if it's been growing in a woods for very long. Very hard to get rid of, a troublesome invasive. You want to spot this and try to get it out of the woods sooner rather than later. The twig is fairly nondescript to just look at it, but if you cut off a little section and look at the wood, you can see that the wood has these very large springwood vessels, much like an oak tree. In fact, if you cut off a short section of this and stick it in a glass of water, you can blow bubbles, which, being basically a 12-year-old kid at heart, I always like to do. Well, thank you. That's all the trees we have for today. I think we should just stop it there.
All right, sounds good.